There's an ancient biblical principle that most people read right past, assuming it's about religious authority or church governance. But what Smith Wigglesworth discovered about this passage revolutionized everything we understand about how reality actually works. This isn't some mystical theory or positive thinking philosophy. This is spiritual mechanics, as real and consistent as gravity, operating whether you're conscious of it or not. Have you ever wondered why some people seem to effortlessly manifest healing, abundance, and transformation in their lives while others struggle endlessly with the same repeated patterns of limitation and defeat? What if I told you that the answer isn't found in your circumstances, your background, or even your prayers, but in something far more powerful that's been operating in your life every single day without your awareness? But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future videos. Here's what most people miss. Every single day, you are binding something into your reality. Right now, in this very moment, your consciousness is acting like a powerful creative force, establishing conditions, limitations, and possibilities in your experience. Has this ever happened to you? You worry about something and suddenly it manifests. You accept a diagnosis as permanent truth and it becomes your lived reality. You agree internally with lack, and lack becomes your constant companion. This isn't coincidence. This is the law of binding and loosing in action, and you've been using it unconsciously your entire life. Smith Wigglesworth understood something that transformed thousands of impossible situations. What you bind in your consciousness must, by spiritual law, become bound in your earthly experience. Not might become, not could become, must become. Think about that for a moment. Every fear you've entertained as fact, every limitation you've accepted as truth, every negative condition you've agreed with internally, you've been binding these things into your reality through the creative power of your own consciousness. But here's where it gets absolutely extraordinary. The same principle that binds limitation can bind freedom. The same law that manifests fear can manifest faith. The same consciousness that creates disease can create healing. Wigglesworth didn't just teach this principle. He proved it again and again through documented cases that defied medical explanation, terminal illnesses that dissolved, financial impossibilities that transformed overnight, broken situations that suddenly reorganized into divine order. What you're about to discover might surprise you, because this isn't about begging God for miracles or repeating positive affirmations until you believe them. This is about understanding the immutable spiritual mechanics of how consciousness creates reality. Stay with me until the end, because what we're about to explore will fundamentally shift how you approach every challenge, every limitation, every impossible situation you're facing right now. The question isn't whether you have this binding power. You've always had it. The question is, what have you been unconsciously binding into your experience? And more importantly, what are you about to deliberately unbind and replace with spiritual truth? Let me show you exactly how this binding process works in your daily life. Because once you see it, you'll never look at your thoughts the same way again. The word bind literally means to tie something down, to make it secure, to establish it as law in your personal reality. And here's the hidden truth most people never grasp. Every single time you accept a condition as permanent, you're activating this binding power. When a doctor gives you a diagnosis and you internally say, "Yes, this is my reality now," you've just bound that condition into your experience. When you look at your bank account and declare to yourself, "I'm always broke," you're binding lack as an established law in your life. This isn't about blame or making you feel guilty for past thoughts. This is about revelation, about suddenly seeing the mechanics behind why certain patterns keep repeating in your journey. Your consciousness has been operating as a binding agent this entire time, tying conditions into place through your inner agreements, through what you've accepted as unchangeable truth. Think about the fears you've treated as facts, the limitations you've called real, the impossible situations you've mentally surrendered to. Each one became bound the moment you gave it your internal yes. But here's where the transformation begins, where the entire game shifts in your favor. You possess the exact same power to unbind. This is the revelation that changed everything for Smith Wigglesworth and the thousands he worked with. The moment, and I mean the very instant, you withdraw your inner agreement from any condition, you begin dissolving its hold on your reality. This isn't about pretending something doesn't exist or living in denial. This is about exercising spiritual authority, recognizing a fundamental truth that most people miss. Consciousness determines experience, not the other way around. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because what we're building here is a community ready for real transformation, not just surface-level spirituality. Every video gives you practical understanding you can apply immediately. Matter doesn't create your reality. Your physical circumstances aren't the cause of your life. They're the effect. And when you understand this at a deep level, when it becomes more than just a nice concept, but an actual operating principle in your mindset, everything available to you expands dramatically. Wigglesworth taught something that sounds almost too simple to be true. Heaven isn't a distant location you reach after you die. Heaven is a state of consciousness, a way of binding spiritual truth so firmly in your awareness that it begins materializing as earthly demonstration right here, right now. When you bind spiritual truth, when you establish God's reality as your foundational conviction rather than the temporary appearances around you, that heavenly state doesn't stay invisible and theoretical. It becomes your lived experience. The healing manifests. The provision appears. The impossible situation reorganizes itself, not because you forced it or manipulated reality, but because you stopped binding the limitation and started binding the truth. Now, I want to go even deeper into this, because understanding the mechanics is one thing, but actually applying this principle in the middle of real crisis, real symptoms, real lack, that's where most people struggle, and that's exactly what we need to address. Write in the comments, "I'm ready to unbind," if this is resonating with your spirit right now. Here's where most people get stuck, and I see this pattern repeatedly in the behind the scenes of every failed attempt at transformation. They're trying to rearrange the furniture while the foundation of the house remains cracked. They want different circumstances, better health, increased provision, healed relationships, but they're keeping their consciousness exactly the same. They're binding the same fears internally while praying for different results externally. And this approach cannot work, not because God isn't listening, but because they're violating a fundamental spiritual law. The outer world is always effect, never cause. Your circumstances are not creating your experience. Your consciousness is. This is the hidden truth that changes everything about how you approach any challenge. What you establish in consciousness must appear in experience, because consciousness is the only creative power operating in your life. Think about that for a moment. You can pray all day for provision while internally binding the belief that lack is your reality. You can beg for healing while secretly agreeing with the diagnosis as permanent truth. The prayers won't override the binding, because the binding is happening at a deeper level, in the secret place where your actual convictions live. When you truly bind the truth that God is the only power, something remarkable happens. Lack doesn't just diminish, it loses its authority over you completely. It can't maintain its grip because you've withdrawn your agreement from it. You've stopped giving it the one thing it needed to stay bound in your reality, your inner yes. This is why Wigglesworth could walk into impossible situations and watch them transform. His consciousness wasn't bound to the appearance. He had established spiritual truth so deeply that the material circumstances had to reorganize around his inner conviction. But here's what most people miss about this process, and it's crucial for your journey. You are not creating truth through this binding work. Truth already exists in its fullness. Heaven's reality is already complete. God's provision, healing, and peace aren't things you need to manufacture or convince God to release. They exist right now in spiritual consciousness. What you're doing through binding is connecting yourself to what already is. You're aligning your awareness with eternal truth rather than temporary appearances. Wigglesworth emphasized something that sounds counterintuitive in our loud, declaration-focused culture. This binding doesn't happen through shouting, through forced belief, through religious performance, or loud proclamations in front of others. It happens in the secret place of your consciousness, in that quiet inner realm where your genuine convictions actually live. It's the deep knowing that shifts everything, not the surface-level hoping. When you silently establish spiritual truth as your foundation, when it becomes your center of gravity rather than just a nice idea you're trying to believe, your entire experience begins reorganizing without effort or strain. This is the revelation that separates those who seek consistent transformation from those who remain frustrated. The impact doesn't come from external noise, but from internal certainty. You're not trying to convince yourself or God. You're simply recognizing what's already true and binding your consciousness to that truth until it becomes more real to you than what your physical senses report. This quiet, unshakable knowing becomes the new foundation from which everything else in your life flows. And what flows from a foundation of spiritual truth looks radically different from what flows from a foundation of fear and limitation. Drop "Truth is my foundation" in the comments if you're grasping this shift in your mindset right now. Let me share something with you that perfectly illustrates this principle in action, because theory means nothing without real-world demonstration. A woman came to Smith Wigglesworth carrying what most would consider an absolute death sentence. The doctors had given her 6 months, maybe less. Terminal was the word they used, and she had done what most people do in that situation. She accepted it. She had internally agreed with the diagnosis, bound death as inevitable truth, and begun making her final arrangements. Her consciousness had tied that condition into place through her complete agreement with it. But Wigglesworth saw something the doctors couldn't see. He wasn't looking at her body or her test results. He was looking at what she had bound in her consciousness. For 3 weeks he worked with her, and here's what's fascinating. He never treated her body, not once. He worked exclusively with her consciousness, helping her unbind the conviction of death and bind the truth of eternal life instead. This wasn't about denying she had received a diagnosis. This was about withdrawing her inner agreement from that diagnosis as the final word on her reality. She later described the shift in a way that captures the entire journey of transformation perfectly. She said it felt both sudden and gradual at the same time. For weeks, nothing seemed to change externally. The symptoms persisted. The medical reports stayed the same. But something was shifting in the hidden realm of consciousness, in that secret place where real decisions about reality are made. Then one morning, she woke up and realized something profound had changed. She no longer believed the diagnosis, not because she was trying to think positively or force herself into denial, but because she genuinely understood at a core level that consciousness, not matter, determined her experience. This revelation didn't come from willpower or religious performance. It came from a fundamental shift in her mindset about what was actually creating her reality. She had unbound death. Within 2 months of that internal shift, every single medical test showed complete remission. The doctors used words like spontaneous and unexplained, searching for rational explanations for something that defied their understanding of how disease works. But Wigglesworth called it exactly what it was: demonstration. Proof that the law of binding and loosing operates with absolute precision when you understand how to work with it. The impact of this revelation extended far beyond those initial months. This woman lived another 23 years. And here's what's crucial about her story. She didn't spend those years in fear of recurrence, constantly worried that the disease would return. She lived in complete freedom because she understood the principle now. She had learned the secret that what you bind in consciousness must manifest in experience. So she kept binding spiritual truth day after day, and her body continued reflecting that inner binding. Her cells reorganized around her consciousness. Her health remained stable not through luck or temporary remission, but through consistent application of spiritual law. This isn't some exceptional miracle reserved for special people or rare situations. This is the law operating exactly as it was designed to operate. The same principle available to her is available to you right now, in whatever situation you're facing. The question isn't whether the law works. It always works. The question is what you're currently binding, and whether you're ready to make a different choice about what you'll establish as truth in your consciousness. What she discovered behind the scenes of her healing is accessible to anyone willing to do the inner work of unbinding limitation and binding spiritual reality instead. Comment: I choose life. If this testimony is stirring something in your spirit about what's possible for you, but this principle doesn't just apply to physical healing. Let me show you how the same law operates in every area of life, because what you're about to hear demonstrates that consciousness creates reality, regardless of the specific challenge you're facing. A businessman came to Wigglesworth in absolute desperation. Bankruptcy wasn't just approaching, it was inevitable. His debts exceeded his assets 3-1. Legal deadlines were closing in, and every rational analysis of his situation pointed to complete financial collapse. He came looking for a miracle, some divine intervention that would supernaturally rescue him from the consequences of his decisions and circumstances. What Wigglesworth gave him instead was far more valuable than a one-time miracle. He taught him about binding and loosing. He showed him the mechanics behind how consciousness creates financial reality, just as surely as it creates physical reality. For 2 weeks, this man engaged in the most important work of his life. And it wasn't about making more sales calls or finding new investors. He practiced refusing to bind his circumstances as ultimate reality. Every time he looked at the numbers and felt that sinking feeling of doom, he caught himself in the act of binding lack as truth and deliberately unbound his agreement with it. Hit that like button. It helps this teaching reach others who need to understand that their consciousness creates their reality. Instead, he began binding his consciousness to a truth that seemed absurd given what his bank account showed, that Spirit's abundance knows absolutely no limitation. This wasn't about repeating affirmations he didn't believe or pretending his debt didn't exist. This was about changing what he established as foundational reality in his consciousness. Was he going to continue binding the appearance of lack as his governing truth? Or was he going to bind the spiritual reality of infinite supply? This decision, made repeatedly throughout each day, became the turning point of his entire financial journey. Here's where it gets really interesting, and this is something you need to understand about how this law operates. Nothing changed externally for 13 days. The bills still came. The creditors still called. The legal deadlines still approached. Every visible indicator suggested that his inner work was accomplishing nothing. This is where most people quit. They try binding truth for a few days, see no immediate change, and immediately rebind the limitation as proof that spiritual principles don't work. But this man had grasped something crucial. The visible world is always lagging behind consciousness. What you're seeing today is the result of what you bound yesterday, last week, last month. Your current binding is creating tomorrow's demonstration. On the 14th day, something remarkable happened that perfectly illustrates how the universe reorganizes when you change what's bound in consciousness. Within hours, literally within a few hours, 3 completely unexpected opportunities arrived. A forgotten investment he'd written off years ago suddenly matured. A business contact he hadn't heard from in months called, with a partnership offer that seemed to come from nowhere. A legal technicality he knew nothing about eliminated half his debt in a single motion. None of these things came from his effort or manipulation. They emerged from the reorganization of reality around his new consciousness. Within 90 days, complete financial restoration had occurred. But here's the real transformation, the lasting impact that matters more than the immediate rescue. He had learned experientially that binding truth in consciousness must produce corresponding earthly demonstration. He didn't just escape bankruptcy, he discovered the principle that would govern his financial life from that point forward. He continued practicing this binding work, not just in crisis, but as his normal operating system, and built lasting prosperity that wasn't dependent on external conditions but flowed from his established consciousness. Right, my breakthrough is coming, if you're recognizing how this applies to your current situation. What you need to understand right now is that this binding process isn't something that only happens when you're actively thinking about it. You are always binding something. Every single moment of every single day, your consciousness is operating as a creative force, establishing conditions based on what you accept as real. This is happening whether you're aware of it or not, whether you believe in it or not. The law doesn't require your belief to function. It simply functions because consciousness creates reality. Period. Most people move through life unconsciously binding negativity, limitation and fear simply through habit and social conditioning. They've been trained since childhood to accept certain things as unchangeable facts. They bind sickness as inevitable because everyone gets sick. They bind financial struggle as normal because that's what they grew up witnessing. They bind broken relationships as expected because disappointment feels familiar. Then they wonder why life feels so hard, why breakthrough seems impossible, why other people seem to experience transformation while they remain stuck. The answer is always found in what they've unconsciously bound as truth through decades of agreement with limitation. The entire game changes when you become conscious of this binding power and start using it deliberately instead of accidentally. This is where real transformation begins, not when circumstances change, but when you become aware that you're the one establishing what's real through your inner agreements. You begin examining what you've actually bound as true in different areas of your life. You start questioning whether your accepted beliefs serve your highest good or keep you trapped in cycles that don't reflect who you're meant to be. This conscious examination is the first step toward freedom, because you can't change what you're not aware of. But here's where many people make a critical mistake in their journey with this principle. Once they understand binding and loosing, they approach it with intense force and effort, trying to make demonstrations happen through sheer willpower. They bind truth in the morning and then spend the entire day anxiously checking to see if it's working yet. This force actually reveals something important. They haven't truly bound the truth at all. They're still struggling with doubt, still uncertain, still trying to convince themselves rather than resting in genuine knowing. Wigglesworth taught something that completely shifts how you approach this practice. He called it resting in God, and it's one of the most powerful complementary techniques for accelerating transformation. When you genuinely bind spiritual truth and consciousness, rest naturally follows. You stop trying to force demonstrations because you understand that you've aligned with the creative power itself. The truth you've bound must manifest because that's how the law works. Your job isn't to make it happen. Your job is to establish the truth and then rest in that establishment. Think about it this way. When you plant a seed in good soil, you don't dig it up every few hours to check if it's growing. You don't stand over it demanding that it sprout immediately. You rest in your knowledge of how seeds work. You've done what needed to be done by planting it, and now nature takes its course. The same principle applies in consciousness. When you've truly bound spiritual truth, you rest, not with passive resignation, but with confident expectation based on understanding how spiritual law operates. This rest itself becomes evidence of genuine binding. Doubt cannot rest. It's constantly anxious, constantly checking, constantly worried that maybe it won't work. But understanding produces natural rest because you know what you know. You've established truth in consciousness, and you trust the law to produce its corresponding demonstration in its perfect timing. This doesn't mean you become inactive in the physical world. It means you stop the mental striving, the inner anxiety, the constant monitoring that actually indicates you haven't fully bound the truth yet. Leave "I am resting in truth" below if this revelation about rest versus force is landing for you right now. Beyond resting, there's another complementary technique that becomes absolutely essential for maintaining your binding work, and Wigglesworth called it watching. This isn't about obsessing over every thought or creating mental exhaustion through constant self-monitoring. This is about becoming a gentle guardian of your consciousness, immediately catching any attempt to unbind spiritual truth and rebind the old limitation. Your mind has been conditioned for decades to automatically bind negativity, fear, and lack. It's going to try to return to those familiar patterns because that's what feels normal, what feels safe in a strange way. Your job is vigilant watching, but without strain or tension. When fear thoughts arise suggesting that the old condition still has power, when worry whispers that nothing is actually changing, when doubt tries to convince you that your binding work is pointless, you gently unbind these thoughts. You don't fight them. You don't create inner warfare or beat yourself up for having them. You simply refuse them your agreement. It's like someone offering you something you don't want anymore. You just decline. No drama, no struggle, just a quiet, "No, I'm not binding that anymore." This watching becomes easier with practice and this is crucial to understand on your journey. Initially, you might need to correct your thoughts dozens of times daily. You'll catch yourself binding the old limitation over and over again. That's completely normal. You're reprogramming decades of unconscious conditioning. But within weeks of consistent watching, the corrections decrease. Your consciousness begins naturally maintaining the binding of truth without constant effort. This is the formation of a new operating system in your mindset, where spiritual truth becomes your automatic response rather than limitation. What accelerates this entire transformation process is learning to live from the invisible rather than from the visible. This is perhaps the most challenging shift for most people because everything in our culture trains us to trust what we see more than what we know spiritually. Most people live completely from the visible world, letting appearances dictate their inner state. When appearances seem negative, they immediately bind negativity. When circumstances look hopeless, they bind hopelessness. This keeps them trapped in a cycle where the material realm controls consciousness, instead of consciousness controlling the material realm. Living from the invisible means something radically different. It means maintaining your binding of spiritual truth, regardless of what the material world currently shows. You have to grasp this fundamental revelation. The visible is always past tense. What you're seeing right now is the result of what you had bound in consciousness weeks or months ago. It's already outdated information about your current reality, your current binding, what you're establishing in consciousness. Today is determining your future visible demonstrations. This understanding completely changes how you respond to current circumstances. When the bank account looks empty, you continue binding abundance truth. When the body shows symptoms, you continue binding spiritual wholeness. When relationships appear broken, you continue binding divine harmony. You live from the invisible truth you have bound, knowing with absolute certainty that the visible must eventually conform, because consciousness is senior to matter. This isn't denial or escapism. This is understanding the mechanics of how reality actually reorganizes itself. You're not ignoring the visible. You're just refusing to let it override the invisible truth you've established as your foundation. This practice requires a level of conviction that goes beyond surface belief. You have to genuinely know that what you've bound in consciousness is more real than what your eyes currently see. Behind the scenes of every major transformation story, you'll find this principle operating. People who experience seemingly impossible breakthroughs weren't lucky. They had learned to live from invisible truth until it became visible demonstration. Type, I live from truth, if you're ready to stop letting visible circumstances control what you bind in consciousness. There's another critical element that determines how quickly your binding work produces visible results, and most people completely miss this because of how we've been trained to think about time. Many people bind truth but immediately project its demonstration into some distant future. They think this will work eventually, or someday I will be healed, or in time my finances will improve. This seems reasonable, even humble, but it's actually sabotaging the entire process. When you project demonstration into the future, you're simultaneously agreeing that limitation has power right now. You're binding future freedom while binding present captivity. And this contradiction keeps you stuck. True binding recognizes something that shifts everything about timing. Spiritual reality exists in its fullness immediately. Not tomorrow, not after you've proven yourself worthy, not once you've suffered enough or learned your lesson. Right now, in this present moment, the truth you're binding is already complete in the realm of consciousness. When you bind health, you bind it as now. When you bind supply, you bind it as already established. This practice of immediacy collapses time in your experience in ways that seem almost impossible until you witness it yourself. Demonstrations that might take months through future-focused consciousness often appear within days or weeks when you practice immediacy. You're not waiting for God to act or for the universe to eventually get around to your request. You're recognizing that spiritual perfection is already established, and your binding makes you aware of what already exists. This changes the entire energy of your practice. There's no begging, no hoping, no anxious waiting. Just recognition of present reality that hasn't manifested visibly yet, but exists completely in consciousness. But let me show you what separates those who experience occasional demonstrations from those who live in continuous transformation. Most people only practice binding work when crisis hits. They face a health emergency and suddenly remember these principles. They encounter financial disaster and start binding. Abundance. They experience relationship breakdown and begin binding harmony. This emergency-based approach produces a roller coaster experience. Victory followed by defeat. Breakthrough followed by collapse. Healing followed by recurrence. It's exhausting and inconsistent because they're only binding truth under pressure and returning to unconscious limitation once the crisis passes. The advanced path that Wigglesworth lived from is entirely different. He made spiritual truth his permanent consciousness, his operating system that ran continuously regardless of circumstances. He didn't bind health only when facing sickness. He maintained continuous binding of wholeness whether symptoms appeared or not. He didn't bind supply only when facing lack. Abundance was his permanent binding whether the bank account was full or empty. This consistent, permanent establishment of truth and consciousness produced a life largely free from the common disasters that plague most people's existence. Not because he was lucky or specially favored, but because those disasters could not find a binding point in his consciousness. This is the real transformation journey. Moving from someone who occasionally uses these principles in emergencies to someone whose entire consciousness is established in spiritual truth as permanent reality. When you reach this level, limitation finds no agreement point in your awareness. Problems still appear because you're living in a material world, but they lose their power to disturb or dominate because your consciousness isn't available for binding them as ultimate truth. You've become so established in spiritual reality that material appearances can't shake your foundation. This doesn't happen through a single decision or a weekend of intensive practice. This develops through consistent application over time, binding truth in situation after situation until it becomes your natural state, your automatic response, your permanent mindset. The impact on your entire life experience is dramatic because you're no longer being tossed around by circumstances. You're creating circumstances from established consciousness. Comment: truth is my operating system. If you're committing to this advanced level of permanent binding practice. If you're still here with me right now, that tells me something important about you. You're not just casually browsing for entertainment. You're genuinely seeking transformation, looking for principles that actually work. In real life, not just theory that sounds good but produces nothing. That's exactly why I create this content. For people like you who are ready to understand how consciousness truly creates reality and are willing to do the inner work that most people avoid. I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because what we're building here is a community of people who are done with surface-level spirituality and ready for the mechanics behind real breakthrough. Every video I create is designed to give you practical understanding you can apply immediately, not just inspire you for a moment and leave you exactly where you started. There's so much more we're going to explore together about how binding and loosing operates in every area of life. And if this message resonated with you, if something shifted in your understanding today, let me know by dropping "this message was meant for me" in the comments right now. I read every single one, and there's something powerful about declaring your commitment to this path. When you write it out, you're actually binding your intention to apply what you've learned here. Hit that like button too, because it helps this teaching reach others who are searching for these exact answers. Someone watching right now needs to understand that they're not powerless, that their consciousness creates their reality, and that like button helps us connect with them. There's a video right here that takes this even deeper into practical application. How to handle the specific challenges that arise when you start binding truth and the material world seems to fight back. Click and continue with me over there, because what you're about to discover will complete what we started here today.